My name is Emily Parker, and I was 16 years old the night my mother told me to leave. Before we begin, if stories about family, forgiveness, and second chances speak to you, I'd be grateful if you'd stay, maybe even subscribe, so we can keep walking through these chapters together. Tonight's story is titled, Mom Kicked Me Out at 16, 10 years later, she stood at my mansion. It started in the most ordinary American way, with a small, tired kitchen and a light bulb that hummed like a bee. The dishwasher coughed every few seconds. A pot of spaghetti sat heavy on the stove, the sauce too sweet because my mother liked to drown out the bite of tomatoes with sugar. She stood there with a wine glass in hand, as if holding dignity by the stem. "You're nothing but a burden," she said. "Get out, right now." If you've never heard those words from a parent, you might think they come with thunder. They don't. They drop like a dull stone in the sink. There's no echo, just a silence so thick you can't swallow through it. I stared at the refrigerator door, at the crooked magnets, the dentist postcard with a smiling molar, the faded Christmas photo from a year we still pretended well. In that photograph, my mother had her arm around me. It looked like love back then. Now it looked like an accident. "I didn't mean," I started, and then stopped, because I realized I had nothing to defend. I had not stolen or lied or broken a law of the house unless breathing too loudly counted. The worst crime I could think of was being second place, second to my brother, second to her expectations, second to a life she thought she deserved and never got. She turned her back and tasted the sauce, added more sugar, and in that small motion I understood this wasn't a fight. It was a verdict. I went to my room. The carpet flattened under my steps like it had decided to give up too. I opened a backpack and took what you take when you're 16 and have to pack a life. A pair of jeans, 2 t-shirts, a hoodie with the school's faded mascot, a nearly empty bottle of body spray. I slipped a library card into my pocket, habit, hope, I don't know. I left the trophies, participation mostly, left the ribbons, left the letter from 9th grade English where Mrs. Dorsey wrote, "You have a voice, Emily, use it. Voices don't weigh much, not enough to justify space." At the door, I paused. I thought of every sitcom I'd ever watched where mothers softened at the threshold, where fathers cleared their throats and said, "Hey, kiddo." On TV, people change right before you leave. In Ohio, on weeknights, they don't. The porch light flickered as if it couldn't decide whether to help. The air smelled like cut grass and gasoline. Somewhere down the block, a game show laugh track leaked through a neighbor's window, the sound of strangers winning prizes I could not imagine. When the door clicked shut behind me, it sounded too polite for how final it was. People think the worst part of being cast out is the cold. It isn't. It's the way the night suddenly feels bigger than your name. You walk and the pavement doesn't remember you. You pass houses, the ranch with the flag, the colonial with the stone path, the split level with the plastic flamingo, and you realize a strange truth about America. From the street, almost everything looks fine. I sat at the bus stop bench on Maple and 3rd. The wood was damp. My backpack made a lopsided pillow. Each passing car threw a slice of light across my face, and for a second I wondered if my mother might come after me in hers, headlights shaking, apology forming. But apologies require a kind of love that can look you in the eye. My mother had run out of that years before. A woman in scrubs walked by, smelling of lemon hand soap and fatigue. She glanced at me, then away, the way people do when they have their own emergencies to survive. I didn't blame her. I learned early that everyone carries a storm, and most of us only have one umbrella. Hunger arrived sooner than fear. It always does. I remembered a jar of peanut butter in our pantry and almost laughed at the absurdity, how our home contained food and light and heat, and yet the place where all that lived no longer had room for me. I pressed my palms together as if they were a bowl and pretended I was holding something warm. In moments like that, you make a promise. Not the kind adults make at midnight on New Year's, paper hats tipped, champagne fizzing. A promise made with bone. I whispered it into my sleeve so the night could witness it. One day I will have a home so steady, so wide with light that no one, not even her, can throw me out again. A moth rattled against the street lamp globe. The bus came and went again. I must have slept in fragments because I woke to the hollow morning sounds. Distant dogs, a trash truck, a teenager's skateboard knocking against a curb. At 16, you don't know how long nights can be. You don't know how many you can survive. You learn by counting one bench, one breath, one heartbeat, one vow. And you carry forward the only thing you can, the next step. So I stood, shouldered the small weight of my backpack and walked toward town, following the thin ribbon of sun along the sidewalk like a line someone had drawn just for me. Whatever comes after this, I told myself, I will build it, brick by quiet brick. And if I ever have a daughter, the door she walks through will never lock behind her. That was the beginning. Not of homelessness, though that came. Not of hunger, though that came too. It was the beginning of the person I would have to become when love did not come back for me. The second night taught me that sleep is not a guarantee. It is a privilege. I drifted in and out on that same bench, startled awake each time headlights swept across my face. A policeman slowed his cruiser once, his window half open, and for a moment I thought he might ask if I was safe. Instead, he nodded toward the no loitering sign bolted to the post and drove off. By the third day, my body had already learned the rhythm of absence. No breakfast, no bed, no certainty. Hunger is not a sharp stab the way people imagine. It's a dull drumbeat, a low throb that makes your thoughts foggy and your pride disappear. I walked past a diner with windows smudged by years of grease and rain. The scent of frying onions pulled me in. Behind the counter was a man with a heavy gut and a name tag that said Carl. His eyes traveled over me, my wrinkled hoodie, the way I kept my hands stuffed into my sleeves as if that could hide the tremble in them. I asked if he needed help washing dishes. He didn't answer right away. He only tossed a rag onto the counter and said, "Can you start now?" That night, I stood in front of a mountain of plates, scraping and rinsing until my arms ached. The steam rose in waves, fogging my glasses and clinging to my hair, but I didn't complain. Every plate I cleaned was one more chance I might not have to sleep on that bench. When the shift ended, Carl handed me a few crumpled bills, less than minimum wage, but more than I had held in weeks, and slid a paper bag across the counter. "Don't waste it," he muttered. Inside was a burger, still warm, wrapped in wax paper. I ate it sitting on the back step of the diner under the orange glow of a buzzing light. Each bite felt like it weighed more than food. It felt like permission to stay alive another day. The next morning I showed up again. No one had asked me to, but Carl didn't turn me away. Soon it became a pattern. School during the day, diner at night, and the bench or library for everything in between. At school, I was invisible. My classmates laughed about homecoming, traded gossip about dates and dances, while I scribbled homework on the margins of napkins from the diner. Teachers looked past me the way you look past a stain on a shirt. You see it, but you decide it's easier to ignore. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from sitting in a room full of people who don't see you. It doesn't roar. It whispers. You don't matter. You never did. I began to live in the library. It smelled of dust and lemon polish, and the warmth wrapped around me like a second skin. Between the shelves, I found voices that filled the silence my family had left behind. Novels about daughters who were chosen. Biographies of men who had clawed their way from nothing to something. Those pages were not just words, they were evidence. Evidence that survival was possible, that success might still be waiting, even for a girl who had been discarded at 16. One evening, sitting cross-legged on the carpet between the fiction and biography aisles, I read a line that stopped me cold. We are not only shaped by what we are given, but by what we are denied. I copied it onto the back of my diner paycheck stub and carried it with me like scripture. Because in that moment, I began to believe that maybe all this emptiness could be used. That the nights on benches, the whispers of not enough, the slammed door at 16, maybe they weren't just endings. Maybe they were the raw materials of a beginning. And for the first time, the thought flickered. What if my mother's rejection had freed me to build a life I could truly call my own? When you live without a home, memories become their own kind of shelter. On nights when the library closed early and the bench felt colder than usual, I wrapped myself in the past. Not because it was warm, but because I needed to understand how the story had started long before it reached me. I remembered my mother as a younger woman, standing by the kitchen window in the late afternoons, staring out at nothing. The glass reflected her face in a way that made her look older, harder. Sometimes she would press the phone to her ear, speaking to my grandmother in clipped, brittle tones. "You always thought I was worthless," I once heard her say, her voice breaking like a plate dropped on tile. From the other end, my grandmother's reply was muffled but sharp, a string of words that sounded more like judgment than comfort. My mother's shoulders shook as she slammed the phone down, but when I reached out to touch her arm, she pulled away as if my hand carried the same poison. Back then, I didn't know what it meant. Now I do. The truth is, my mother was never taught how to love gently. She grew up in a house where affection was rationed like wartime sugar, doled out sparingly, withheld often. My grandmother believed daughters were meant to serve, to endure, to survive without complaint. And so my mother learned early that softness was weakness, and silence was strength. But lessons learned in pain have a way of spilling into the next generation. By the time I came along, my mother had already built armor around her heart. To her, my presence wasn't joy, it was responsibility. Every laugh of mine was a noise, every mistake a threat to the fragile order she had created. Where other children found comfort in their mother's embrace, I found cold corrections and eyes that weighed me against impossible scales. It's strange how cruelty can masquerade as care. She would say, "I only push you because I want you to be strong." But strength born from fear doesn't last. It hollows you out, leaving you brittle and aching. I came to realize that I was not the beginning of my mother's anger. I was only the continuation of hers. She passed it down the way families pass down recipes or heirlooms. Except what I inherited was not a quilt or a ring. It was the echo of generations of hurt. And once I understood that, the question grew louder. If she could not break free from her wounds, could I? Or was I destined to hand this same emptiness to the children who might come after me? That fear haunted me more than hunger, more than benches, more than cold nights, because I knew the cycle would only end if someone, somewhere, decided to end it. I did not know it yet, but that someone would have to be me. People like to tell me I was resilient, as if the word were a metal you could polish and wear. But resilience is sometimes just a child with no other choice. If you asked people what broke me at 16, most would guess the obvious things. The nights on a bench, the hunger that hummed under my ribs, the fear of a future with no address. They would be wrong. Those things sting, yes, but they are straightforward. A burger can quiet hunger. A blanket can soften a bench. Even fear obeys daylight. What pressed the breath from my chest was quieter. It was the dinner table where laughter never reached my side. It was the way my mother praised my brother in a voice that opened doors, then turned to me and spoke in a voice that closed them. It was the measuring, always the measuring. How my report card stacked against someone else's daughter. How my face would be so pretty if... How my best was almost, nearly, not quite enough. There is an ache that comes from being unfed. There is another ache, deeper, that comes from being unseen. At the library, I read about poverty lines and safety nets, statistics that charted misery with tidy decimals. No chart measured a daughter listening for her name and hearing only the clatter of forks. No survey tallied the times a child swallowed a story because there was no one in the house to hold it safely. Once, between the stacks, I watched a mother kneel to tie her little girl's shoe. The girl leaned on her mother's shoulder, balanced, giggled when the knot came out crooked. It happened in 10 seconds. 10 seconds that explained everything I had been missing. I turned away so I wouldn't intrude on their ordinary holiness. Later, at the diner, a couple argued at booth 3. The man's voice rose, the woman's eyes dropped. Carl slid their check between them like a referee tossing a towel into the ring. He came back to the kitchen, sighed, and said, "People hurt each other because it's cheaper than healing." Then he handed me a bus tub loaded with plates, and we went back to pretending the world could be cleaned with hot water and soap. I kept a scrap of paper in my pocket, the one where I had copied the line from the library. We are not only shaped by what we are given, but by what we are denied. I touched it whenever the whisper started, "You don't matter." You never did. Every time my fingers found the soft fray of that edge, I reminded myself, denial can also be direction. If no one will call your name, you learn to answer to your own. This wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It was a diagnosis. I began to see my life not as a story of money lost or found, but as a story of affection rationed, recognition withheld, kindness treated like a luxury item we could not afford. Once you name a wound, you can stop bleeding from it in secret. On a Sunday morning, the church bells from St. Mary's drifted across Maple like a memory. I didn't go inside. I stood on the sidewalk and watched families pour through the doors, pressing collars, smoothing dresses, tucking hair behind small ears. A woman who could have been my mother's age glanced at me and smiled, the kind of smile that says, "I see you," without demanding anything back. It startled me how a stranger's face could feel like a hand laid gently on the spine. I went back to the bench and wrote in the margin of an overdue paperback, "The opposite of hunger is not fullness. The opposite of hunger is being held." I underlined it twice. It felt like truth. If you grow up on comparisons, you start to compare your pain to other people's, to rank it, to ask whether you're allowed to name it at all. But pain is not a contest. Pain is a teacher, and mine kept repeating the same lesson until I finally said it aloud. It wasn't the empty fridge. It was the empty room where love should have been. That realization did not fix anything. It didn't return me to a warm bed or conjure a mother who would pull me back inside. What it did was point me toward a different kind of survival. If what broke me was the absence of tenderness, then my only way forward was to build tenderness into the bones of my days, one small mercy at a time. I started with what I could control. When a customer snapped at me, I answered softly, not because I owed them softness, but because I wanted to practice having it to give. When I had $2 left after bus fare, I bought a notebook instead of candy. I began to write the sentences I had needed to hear my whole life. You are not a burden. You are allowed to be here. Your effort counts even when no one claps. I read them back to myself under the hum of the library lights until the words felt less like wishful thinking and more like scaffolding. At school, Mrs. Dorsey caught me after class. "You look tired," she said, but not the way people say it to scold you. She said it the way a nurse might, careful and attentive. She handed me a stapled packet of scholarship links. "You have a voice, Emily. Use it," she said again, the same sentence from her old letter, and this time it didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like instructions. On the walk back to the diner, the sky over town turned the softest kind of orange, the kind that makes grocery store parking lots look almost cinematic. I thought of my mother at our kitchen stove, stirring sweetness into sauce, mistaking sugar for love. I understood suddenly that I could not make her different, but I could choose a recipe she had never learned. It is a strange moment when you realize the home you crave may not come from the house you left. It may have to be built, word by word, kindness by kindness, the way a mason lays brick not because the first row is a castle, but because he trusts what rows can become. I folded the scholarship packet into my backpack, slid the notebook beside it, and headed toward the diner's back door. The steam, the plates, the noise, they would all be waiting. So would the line I had copied, soft as cloth in my pocket. I pressed it once with my thumb and stepped inside to the heat, ready to earn the next small mercy, and then the next, until mercy became muscle. The scholarship links were a map I didn't know how to read, but I carried them anyway. After the dinner rush, when the diner's noise thinned to the clink of a lone spoon, I sat at the corner table with a cup of water and unfolded the packet until the edges went soft. Most of the opportunities had deadlines months away, essays I wasn't sure I could write. But on the last page, half crooked from a bad photocopy, was a list of free online courses at the public library's computers. The next afternoon I signed my name on the computer log, the pen tethered by a frayed string. The monitor flickered to life with the charity of old machines. I typed free classes and fell into a river I hadn't known existed. Tutorials on typing, spreadsheets, a beginner's course on HTML. I didn't know what HTML was. I only knew it was something I could learn without asking permission. At first, it felt like trying to decipher a hymn in a language I didn't speak. Brackets and slashes and words like div and class that sounded nothing like the world I knew. But the screen obeyed when I asked it to. One small line of code, one small change on the page. A blue word turned red. A box nudged left. It was the opposite of my home, predictable, responsive. If I did the work, something shifted. I made a schedule the way some people start diets. Overambitious, hopeful, school from 8 to 3, diner from 4 to 10, library from 10:30 to closing. On nights the librarian took pity and pretended not to see me, I stayed an hour longer, the cursor blinking like a metronome, keeping time for a life I was rewriting. Carl noticed. He wasn't the noticing kind, but one night he came out back while I was taking a break on the milk crate by the dumpsters. He flicked a cigarette into the gravel and nodded toward the backpack at my feet, heavy with printouts. "You building something in there?" "A ladder," I said before I could stop myself. He huffed a laugh. "Good. Just don't climb it so fast you forget to look down." "I won't," I said and meant it, though I knew the only way to survive was to look up and keep looking. Small things began to change. I stopped sleeping on the bench the week misses. Dorsey helped me file a youth in crisis form that qualified me for a cot at a transitional shelter for students. It wasn't much, a room with 2 bunk beds and a window that stuck, but it had a lock I controlled. I cried the first night without meaning to, not from sadness, but from the luxury of choosing when darkness ended. At the library, a flyer near the bulletin board caught my eye. Local florist needs simple website, pay negotiable. The paper had been tugged down and repinned so many times the holes looked like a constellation. I copied the number, my hand shaking as if a wrong scribble might revoke my chance. When I called, a woman answered with a voice that smelled like lilacs. "Petals and pine," she said. "This is Nora." I told her I was a student and that I could make her something clean and simple. I didn't tell her I had built only a handful of practice pages with fake words and boxes that never had to hold anything real. "What would you charge?" she asked. The number in my head was big enough to feed me for a week and small enough not to scare her. 75, I said, and hated how timid it sounded. "Done," Nora replied as if I'd offered a fair trade for a fair day's work. Can you come by after school? We'll look at some photos. I want it to feel like Saturdays. I didn't know how a website felt like Saturdays, but I wrote it down anyway, underlining it twice, Saturdays. That night, I borrowed a library book about color and fonts. I practiced on the shelter's communal computer until my eyes burned. I learned that white space is not emptiness, it is breath. I learned that good lines guide tired eyes home. I learned that a soft green can make people think of fresh stems and cold water, of vases waiting on kitchen tables where dinner might be kind. When I showed Nora the mock-up, she pressed her palms together as if saying grace. "Yes," she whispered, "that's it." She tucked the bills into an envelope and slid it across the counter, then added a handful of tulips for your room. They leaned in the vase like ballerinas that had chosen rest. I set them on the shelter windowsill and watched their petals open with the morning, quiet proof that some things bloom even when they have been moved and moved again. I wasn't suddenly successful. Most days still felt like wading through waist-high water. The shelter's rules chafed. The diner's grease lived under my nails. School remained a room where I learned more about absence than algebra. But the current had shifted. Work led to work. The florist told a bakery. The bakery told a barber. The barber told his cousin who ran a towing service. I learned to invoice. I learned to say, gently but firmly, "That will cost more." I learned to sign my emails with my full name because Emily Parker looked like a person who could be relied on. On the nights when nothing went right, when code broke and buses were late and the shelter turned me away for missing curfew by 4 minutes, I opened the notebook and wrote what I needed to hear. "You are not late to your own life. Keep walking." When the work clicked and the page looked like Saturdays, I wrote, "See, you can build warmth." One afternoon, Mrs. Dorsey stopped me in the hall again. "I read your essay," she said, the scholarship one I had turned in with hands still damp from the dish sink. "You wrote about the opposite of hunger." "The opposite is being held," I said, and felt the truth settle between us like a small, shared blanket. She nodded. "There's a summer program, tech and writing. Partial stipend. I think you should apply." She slipped a brochure into my hand the way a mother might slip a note into a lunch bag. I stared at the glossy photos of smiling kids with lanyards and wondered what it would feel like to be one of them. On my walk to the diner, the wind carried the smell of rain over hot asphalt, a scent that always felt like the beginning of something. I remembered that night at 16, the promise I'd whispered into my sleeve. I could feel it now not as a threat flung into the dark, but as a blueprint, lines and measurements, costs and care. I wasn't there yet, not remotely, but the distance between bench and belonging had become measurable. A course completed. A page deployed. $75 earned honestly. Tulips opening on a cheap sill. I tightened my grip on the brochure, pushed through the diner's back door, and tied on my apron. The steam rose, the plates clattered, the orders barked. The world asked the same old things of me, and for the first time I felt like I had something new to give back. Not defiance, not despair, direction. When the rush slowed, Carl leaned on the counter and studied me. "You look different," he said. "I feel pointed," I answered, searching for the word. "Good," he said, wiping a circle on the stainless steel with a rag until it shone. "Point yourself at tomorrow. It'll meet you halfway." The brochure lived in my backpack for a week before I believed it belonged to me. On the 8th day, I filled out the application at the library, typing in the blanks like I was easing a ship into narrow docks. Name, address, I used the shelters. GPA not proud but honest, essay. I wrote about code as a language that answered back, about websites that felt like Saturdays, about the opposite of hunger. I read it twice, then hit submit and told no one. Hopes, I'd learned, bruise easily when handled in public. In May, an email arrived on a library computer that wheezed like an old dog. congratulations, partial stipend, housing in a dorm with linoleum floors and nervous laughter, a lanyard with my name. I cupped the screen with both hands as if the light might spill. The program was smaller than the brochure promised and more human. In a classroom that smelled like dry erase markers and vending machine coffee, a woman named Tara taught us to break big problems into parts we could hold. She wore scuffed sneakers and kept her hair in a messy knot that made her look perpetually in motion. On the third day, she said, "Build something you wish you'd had," and walked out, leaving the door open like an invitation. I stared at the blank project page and thought about all the sentences I'd written in my notebook when nights felt too long. You are not a burden. You are allowed to be here. I wished there had been a place to put those thoughts besides paper, a small, private room that lived inside a phone, where someone like me could speak to herself kindly and be answered with more kindness. By the end of the week, I had a crude prototype, a daily check-in with 3 simple prompts and a place to store the words that kept you upright. It wasn't pretty. The buttons misaligned when you tilted the screen. The colors argued with each other, but it worked. When I tapped save, the words stayed. It felt like tacking a prayer to a wall and finding it still there in the morning. I showed Tara with the apology already formed. She swatted it away. "Stop prefacing," she said. "Show me the thing." I did. She scrolled, nodded, then asked, "Who is this for?" "For the girl who doesn't get told anything good at home," I said. The answer surprised me with its clarity. "Then build it like a promise to her," Tara said. "Clean, kind, no friction." I wrote that on an index card and taped it to my dorm wall, build it like a promise. The summer moved fast in the way good things do when you're afraid to blink. I learned to test, to break, to fix. I learned that failure is faster when you court it on purpose. When the stipend hit my account, I bought exactly 2 things: a used phone with more memory and a pair of decent headphones. The rest went to a savings jar back at the shelter, cash folded small and hidden in a cereal box no one wanted. At the end of the program, we demoed our projects in a room decorated with crepe paper that drooped in the humidity. A handful of local people came, teachers, a city councilman, 2 small business owners, 1 woman from a nonprofit with a clipboard and the power to say maybe. I watched their faces as they watched my screen. For the first time, I saw strangers' shoulders drop at something I had made. It looked like relief. It looked like being held. Afterward, Tara squeezed my shoulder. "Keep going," she said. "Get a name, put a site up, ship something small and true." I filed the paperwork for an LLC at the public terminal, breath hitching as I typed Parker and Light, because naming something makes it real, and Light was what I had been chasing since 16. I rented a basement studio that smelled like damp concrete and possibility. The window was a slit near the ceiling where shoes passed by in pairs. I loved it irrationally. The key turned in both directions because it belonged to me. The diner shifted from survival to anchor. I cut my hours to evenings only and told Carl I might be there less. He grunted like a man who had expected this. On my last full-time shift, he handed me a battered notebook with grease on the cover. "Everybody write something down," he said. "Might as well be the truth." Work led to work the way vines find fences. The florist told the bakery told the barber. The barber's cousin asked if I could help him set up online scheduling for his towing service. Between jobs, I nudged my prototype forward. Cleaner lines, gentler prompts, a quiet space to store the sentences that hold you up when no one else will. I called it Harbor because that's what it felt like in my palm, a safe spot between weathers. There were missteps, the kind you only admit to when you're tired and honest. I took on a client who wanted fast and cheap, and then wanted faster and cheaper. I said yes to a timeline that ate my week and spat me out. I broke the app with 1 line of code at midnight and had to comb through until 3 to find the comma that had wandered where it shouldn't. The shelter turned me away one night when I missed curfew by those same minutes, and I slept in the studio lobby on a carpet that held the smell of other people's lives. But the current had changed. When bad days knocked me to my knees, there was a next step to reach for, and then another. I wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. I was building a rhythm. One afternoon, a message arrived through the barely there contact form on the harbor landing page. It was from a college student in another state, someone I would never meet. "I used your app today," she wrote. "It asked me to write one sentence I wish I'd heard growing up. I wrote, 'You are allowed to rest.' Then it reminded me to breathe. I cried in the good way, 'Thank you.' I stared at her words until the screen blurred. The room was small, but in that moment, it felt vast, like a place where the world could come and lay something down. I printed the email and taped it beside "Build It Like a Promise." The wall above my desk had become a collage of instructions and proof. Mrs. Dorsey's scholarship links, Tara's index card, a receipt for tulips that had long since wilted, sketch after sketch of interfaces that tried their best to be kind. On the way to the diner that evening, the sky did that improbable Midwestern thing where it turns gold and makes strip malls look like paintings. I thought about my mother, the sugar in the sauce, the verdict in her voice. I realized that I had not beaten her so much as outgrown the room where her words could reach me. It wasn't triumph. It was distance. And distance, for the first time, felt like safety. When I pushed through the back door, Carl was stacking plates, counting without looking. "You're late," he said, then glanced up and waved it off. "Kidding, you're fine." "I got an email," I blurted, still breathless with it. "From someone using the app." He nodded like a man who'd just been told the weather would hold. "Good, keep it small, keep it honest." "Why small?" I asked, surprised. "Because small is sturdy." He set the last plate and leaned on the counter. "You build sturdy, it carries big without breaking." That night, as the grill hissed and the receipts fluttered and the door swung on its hinge, I felt something I hadn't felt since before I could remember. Not joy exactly, not even peace. It was steadiness, like the tide when it learns it's allowed to keep coming back. I went home to the basement and added one more line to the notebook Carl had given me. Mercy becomes muscle if you practice it daily. Then I turned out the light, the room soft around me, the window catching the passing feet of people headed wherever they believed they were meant to be. I had no illusion it would be easy from here. But for the first time, the map in my backpack was one I had drawn myself, and the legend made sense. Learn, build, rest, repeat, and somewhere in the middle of all that, help someone breathe. The steadiness held long enough for routine to grow around it. Morning light through the slit of my basement window. Coffee that tasted like courage. 3 hours of client work, 2 hours on harbor, a nap that felt like permission, and then the diner, a metronome for my days. Growth, when it came, did not arrive like a parade. It arrived as a trickle of strangers who found harbor in ways I couldn't trace. A student tagging a friend, a nurse on a night shift, a man who wrote that he hadn't cried in 20 years until the app asked him to write one kind sentence to himself. I began to see patterns in the anonymous numbers. Mornings were busy, nights busier, Sundays a hush that lifted by evening. I learned to read dashboards the way sailors read tides. With usage came strain. Harbor wheezed under the weight of people leaning on it. Buttons lagged. A bug ate entries after midnight and gave them back in duplicate like a stutter. One Tuesday, the server crashed while I was on the line at the diner, juggling a tray of pancakes and a table that wanted more butter and less everything else. I texted Tara with grease on my fingers, down. I don't know why. She replied in 3 seconds, breathe, roll back, keep a change log. Remember, small and sturdy. I rolled back. It held. I wrote keep a change log on a post-it and stuck it to my wall next to build it like a promise. Money stayed a tender subject. The stipend ended. Client work paid the rent if I didn't exhale too hard. My savings jar, the cereal box in the shelter, grew by inches, not feet. Then a florist's cousin's wife, the grapevine never stops surprising, mentioned Harbor to a community college counselor, who emailed to ask if I'd speak for a small honorarium. I stood at a podium in a room that smelled like pencil shavings and nerves and told a dozen students about dashboards and bugs and the opposite of hunger. Afterwards, a soft-spoken kid in a hoodie asked if he could help. "Help how?" I said, suspicious of charity. "Code," he said, hands in pockets. "I'm better at databases than feelings." He half smiled. "Maybe that's why I like your thing." His name was Mateo. He became my first teammate without either of us using the word. We met at the library with laptops and cheap coffee. He spoke in schemas. I translated to sentences. He moved Harbor's entries to a sturdier place and taught me to back up what you couldn't bear to lose. I taught him that prompts should feel like hands, not orders. We wrote a page that said, "You can rest here," and another that said, "Try again tomorrow." Tomorrow is generous. A local blogger with a kind following wrote a piece about a tiny app that feels like a hug. The phrase embarrassed me and saved us. Traffic doubled, then tripled. With the traffic came an email from someone with a company signature I recognized only from storefronts and billboards. "Would you be open to a coffee?" Tara read over my shoulder. "Say yes," she said, "and bring a notebook. Write down everything. Don't sell your soul for a sandwich." We met in a cafe where the pastries looked like sculpture. The woman in the blazer asked smart questions and listened harder than most people with money do. "Why Harbor?" she asked. "Because some of us had to build our own," I said, surprising myself with how simple it sounded when I didn't dodge it. She nodded, slow. "Do you want this to be a business, Emily, or a diary?" It wasn't a trap. It was a crossroads. "A business that feels like a diary," I said after a beat. "Private, sturdy, kind, but with the resources to actually help." She smiled as if I'd given the right answer to a test no one had told me I was taking. 2 weeks later, a small check cleared into a bank account with my name and the word LLC beside it. It was not mansion money. It was breathing money. I paid off the last of what I owed the shelter and signed a lease on a ground-floor studio with a real window that opened, a place where the air moved and so did I. I bought a table. The first thing I ever owned that wasn't a necessity. Pine, with a scratch along one leg like a scar. I put the table by the window and set 2 chairs though there was only me. Every morning, I placed my coffee on the left side and my laptop on the right and told myself, there is room here for the person you're becoming. Mateo and I kept Harbor small on purpose. No ads, no dark patterns. A pay-what-you-can option that we debated for hours and finally implemented with the quiet knowledge that generosity is a risk worth taking. Some months, the numbers didn't add up and I slept with math in my teeth. Other months, a cluster of thank you notes landed all at once, $5 here, 10 there, from people who said the app had made their mornings a little softer. I printed a few and taped them up until the wall began to look like a quilt. One afternoon, Nora from the flower shop walked in with a box. "For your office," she said, although office was generous for a room with a table and 2 chairs. In the box was a small plant with leaves the exact green of the Harbor home screen. "It's hardy," she said. "Neglect it a little and it will forgive you." I laughed harder than the joke required and promised to try. There were setbacks that tried to steal their old throne. A release that wiped a day of entries for a small group of users. I wrote to each one personally to say I was sorry and meant it. A week where the diner cut hours, and I felt the familiar tug of scarcity creeping under the door. A letter from the shelter reminding me to update paperwork or lose access to the mailbox I still used for official things because I didn't trust the new place to be permanent yet. I updated it that afternoon. I allowed myself, privately, to begin trusting anyway. Sometimes I walked past my old street, not because I wanted to, but because the bus routed that way and I refused to fold in on myself every time memory crossed my path. The house looked smaller. The porch bulb had been replaced. The magnets on the refrigerator were different, of course. I was the only one still cataloging them. I did not stand long. I did not knock. I kept moving, the way you do when you know the past has nothing new to teach you today. On a rainy Thursday, a message came from a larger publication asking if I'd talk about Harbor on a podcast. I recorded in my studio under a blanket draped over the table to muffle the echo. The host asked about metrics. I gave them. He asked about mission. I tried to say it clean. People deserve a place to put their hard words and get gentler words back. He paused, then said, I wish I'd had that at 19. For a moment, the air inside the blanket felt like church. After the episode aired, downloads spiked in neat little mountains on the dashboard. Mateo sent me a string of exclamation points followed by a link to an error log, because success is never alone. We patched. We scaled. We ate noodles out of paper cups with the reverence of kings. I slept 3 hours and dreamed of a harbor with lights that never went out. I bought a used car that started on the first try and did not apologize. I drove to the ocean the next Sunday because it felt appropriate to meet the word I had tattooed all over my life. Standing on the shore, I thought of the bench and the library and the diner and the plant with forgiving leaves. I thought of the promise I had whispered at 16 and how it had transformed, brick by small brick, into something you could lean your back against. On the drive home, I didn't notice that my phone had missed a call, or that a voicemail was waiting. The number was familiar in a way that tightened the throat before the mind caught up. I let it sit until the apartment was quiet and the table held only the plant and the notebook. Then I pressed play and heard a voice I had not heard in years, older and thinner, say my name like a question. Emily, it's your mother. Could you call me back? I listened to the message 3 times, each pass sanding away a little more disbelief until only the raw grain remained. My mother's voice had changed. It was thinner, like fabric that had been washed too often. She said my name as if testing whether it still fit inside her mouth. I put the phone face down on the table and watched the plant Nora had given me settle against the window light. Leaves don't hurry, I thought. They turn toward what feeds them and let time do the rest. I tried to borrow their patience and failed. There is a reflex you develop when the person who hurt you reaches out. It is equal parts curiosity and self-defense. Part of you wants to run back to the old theater, take your old seat, watch the old play. Part of you knows the exits now and keeps your hand on the handle. I made tea I didn't drink. I walked circles so small my steps erased each other. Then I pressed the call button and braced for the past. She answered on the second ring. Emily? The word frayed on the edges. It's me, I said, and immediately wished I'd chosen something less generous. It's Emily would have been smarter. Boundaries can start with pronouns. There was a pause so long I imagined the line had gone dead. Then, I didn't know if this number still, she trailed off. How are you? People who taught you don't matter shouldn't get first crack at asking how you are. But life is messy, not procedural. I'm okay, I said, neutral as a weather report. She cleared her throat, a small, nervous sound I remembered from years when she had to speak to teachers or police about my brother. I could use some help. The words landed with an old thud. Once upon a time, help had meant me proofreading a form or running an errand she didn't want. This help sounded bigger, heavier. What kind? I asked and kept my voice level. Just could we talk? She rushed the last word as if speed could keep the plea from sounding like one. Public place, I said before my heart could interrupt. Afternoon, the cafe on Linden tomorrow at 2. Yes, she said too quickly. Yes, that would be. She didn't finish. We settled on the time, and I hung up and set the phone down like something that might crack if handled wrong. Sleep didn't stick that night. I lay awake and rehearsed a dozen versions of the conversation, stern, soft, detached, kind, like outfits you try on before you admit none of them feel like skin. I thought of the bench on Maple and 3rd, of the smell of grease in my hair, of the scrapbook wall above my table, build it like a promise. You can rest here. Keep a change log. I smiled at that last one in the dark. Boundaries are a kind of change log, too. What you allow now, what you never will again. At the cafe, I chose the table in the back where the light fell generous and the door felt far away. She arrived 5 minutes early, a habit from the old days when being on time for other people's approval was currency. She looked smaller. The coat was too big, the kind of thrift store wool that has lived several lives and remembers all of them. Her hair, once a careful helmet of curls, had surrendered to its natural shape, gray threading through like honesty. "Hi," she said, standing there with her hands on the back of the chair as if asking permission to sit. I nodded. She lowered herself slowly, a woman easing into water she wasn't sure would hold. Up close, I could see the ways time had been unkind. Lines around the mouth that hard truths carve, a faint tremor in the left hand. She reached for the menu and then set it back down, as if eating might be too intimate a thing to do in front of me. "I heard you on the radio," she said, eyes on the tabletop. "Well, a podcast, your what do you call it, harbor." She said the word carefully, like a password she wasn't sure she should know. They were talking about the app, about helping people. The room bent for a second, the way heat wobbles air above a summer highway. I pictured her in a quiet kitchen, the radio on, my voice floating into a space that once held my teenage silence. "It's for people who need a place to put their hard words," I said. She nodded. I needed to hear that. A small, almost embarrassed laugh. I suppose I should have heard it sooner. An apology would have fit right there. It did not arrive. I felt the old impatience rise and made it sit. "What did you want to talk about?" I asked. She folded her hands, then unfolded them, then smoothed the napkin until it looked ironed. "I lost the house." The sentence flung itself into the space between us, a bird that had hit glass. "After your father left," she stopped, corrected. "After we divorced, I thought I could manage, but I couldn't. The mortgage, the taxes, your brother, well, he's got his own problems. I'm staying with a friend for now, but it's not." She shook her head. "It's not a solution. A strange thing happens when pain returns wearing someone else's clothes. You recognize the gate. I remembered that kitchen, the light bulb's hum, the sweet sauce. I remembered a woman holding a wine glass like a lifeline. "What do you need?" I said, and kept my voice part business, part mercy. "Just guidance." The word was foreign on her tongue. "I heard you know about resources, programs. You always were good with finding things." It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever received from her. It arrived with a stutter and sat shyly on the edge of the table. I could have told her about shelters, about housing assistance, about numbers you call and forms you fill and lines you stand in. I could have pulled up a browser and clicked where she should click. Instead, I reached for a pen. "Let's start with what you have," I said. "ID, documents, any savings, any debts, we'll make a list." She blinked, surprised at the ordinariness of it. "A list," she repeated, as if the idea itself might tie something back together. We worked. I wrote headings: rent relief, food assistance, medical, debt negotiation. I heard my voice go steady, the way Tara's had when she taught us to split big problems into parts you could hold. I asked questions and waited for answers that came haltingly at first, then in a reluctant flow. At one point she lifted her gaze and studied me the way a nurse might watch a monitor. "You're different," she said. "I'm steady," I answered before I could dress it up. "I didn't used to be." She swallowed. "I know." The confession was smaller than the harm, but it was true, and truth counts even when it is late. When we had enough on paper to count as a plan, I slid the list across to her. "Start with these 2 today," I said, tapping the numbers. "I'll text you links. If you get stuck, call, but we'll keep everything in writing too." I smiled a little to soften what I had to say next. "It helps me stay clear." "Clear," she repeated, and I saw the word land, boundary dressed as clarity. "I can do that." We sat for a minute in the quiet that follows work, not the tense silence of old dinners, but the kind that lets the air settle around new shapes. The barista announced a fresh tray of muffins, and someone laughed at a table near the window. Normal life went on at its unremarkable pace, a mercy I didn't take for granted. "I'm proud of you," she said finally, the sentence uneven but upright. "I don't know if that matters." "It matters," I said, because some truths should be named even when they arrive with a limp. It mattered that she said it. It mattered that I didn't need it the way I once would have. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that made the world look newly washed. We stood. She hovered, unsure about goodbye. In a different script, we might have hugged and dissolved and promised holidays. In this one, we shook hands, 2 adults agreeing to try something careful. She squeezed once lightly and left, her coat flaring a little in the door's draft. I stayed and watched the condensation slide down my untouched tea. My hands shook, then steadied. I sent the links. I set a reminder to check in next week. I wrote in my notebook, "Help without undoing yourself. Love with a lock on the door." On the walk home, the wind moved the leaves in Nora's plant color across the sidewalk. I thought of Harbor and Mateo and Tara and Carl. I thought of Mrs. Dorsey and her stapled packets. I thought of the bench and how far a person can travel without changing streets. Back at the studio, the dashboard showed a gentle swell, Sunday night kindness arriving on people's phones like tide. I added a new prompt to the rotation. Name one boundary that is saving you right now. Then I closed the laptop and stood by the real window that opened, watching the evening choose its colors. The phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Thank you," I called. "They can see me Tuesday." No signature. She didn't need one. I wrote one more line in the notebook before bed. Sometimes the harbor you build is big enough for the ship that hurt you to dock without sinking you. Then I turned off the light and let the quiet hold. The week after the cafe, my days took on a new symmetry. Morning check-ins with Mateo, an hour for the inbox that now filled with strangers' confessions, code until the brain fuzzed, a walk around the block to remind my body it had a job too, then back to the table to keep Harbor small and sturdy. I texted my mother twice. Links, deadlines, a question or two, then put the phone face down and returned to the work that kept me upright. Growth kept arriving like a tide you don't notice until your shoes are wet. A therapist in Wisconsin emailed to say she'd started recommending Harbor between sessions. Sometimes people need a place to hear themselves before they can hear me. A community clinic asked if they could license a private version for their patients. Mateo and I spent a weekend carving out a clean lane that honored privacy without breaking our promise to the people who trusted us alone. A teacher wrote, "We use your one gentle sentence prompt with 10th graders on Mondays." The room gets quieter in the good way. With each new use, the app became more itself. We added a feature that let people set prompts to appear at dawn or dusk, bookends for days that frayed. We built a quiet archive where the sentences you wrote to yourself could be gathered by season. Winter words, summer words, a private almanac of survival. We resisted badges and streaks, and any gamification that confused tenderness with achievement. Some afternoons, the pressure to grow faster knocked on the door in a very professional suit. I let it wait on the porch. Money loosened just enough to let me breathe without counting. The counselor's small contract paid for a second server and a better chair. I replaced the thrift store lamp that flickered like anxiety with one that threw a steady, kind light. I bought a second plant and laughed at myself because apparently I had become the kind of person who measured stability in leaves. My mother texted in sentences that had learned to keep to their lane. Got the appointment. Paperwork was confusing. I called back. They helped. A week later, approved for temporary assistance. Thank you. Then unexpectedly, your brother called. He's trying. I don't know if he'll succeed. I hope you are well. The ellipsis felt like a lesson in restraint from someone who had never learned it. I replied with a simple I hope so too. Love, I was discovering, can be real without being raw. One morning, an email with a subject line that made my stomach flip. We'd like to feature Harbor. A journalist from a tech site wanted to tell the story of a tiny app that refuses to be loud. I told the truth. Bench, diner, library, Tara, Mateo, Nora's tulips, Carl's notebook, the sentence about the opposite of hunger. The piece ran with a photo of my hands around a mug because I still didn't like cameras. The traffic graph climbed a careful staircase. With it came more messages. I used Harbor in the hospital parking lot before walking in to say goodbye. I keep my father's voice in the archive now, but it says kinder things. I'm a firefighter. I write one line after every shift. It keeps the smoke out of my head. Tara sent a 3-word text, don't chase wind. I taped it next to build it like a promise and keep a changelog. The wall had become a choir of sentences that kept me in tune. We hired a part-time support person, a woman named Leela who wrote replies like soft ropes thrown to people in rough water. She was the first person besides Mateo and me to see the inbox, and I was irrationally protective at first, hovering over her shoulder until she laughed and swatted me away. Go fix your commas, she said. I'll hold the humans. A regional foundation reached out. They had a small grant for tools that improved community mental health. We like that you're not trying to be everything, they wrote. The application asked for a budget, and for the first time in my life, I wrote numbers that matched plans instead of prayers. Server costs, Leela's hours, a modest stipend for a student contributor we wanted to bring on. When the approval came, I walked to the ocean again and stood with my shoes off, letting the water find my ankles and then leave, over and over, the exact rhythm of persistence. Meanwhile, the studio began to feel both too big and too small. Too big at night when the quiet amplified every creak, too small in the day when laptops and bodies and ideas needed air. Mateo suggested a co-working space with windows that made you stand up straighter. It smelled like coffee and newly sharpened pencils and optimism. We rented 2 desks and moved the plants, the lamp, the notebook with grease still on the cover. I kept the pine table in the studio because part of me liked the idea of a place that remembered all the versions of me who had sat there. There were still days that buckled. A minor data scare that turned out to be a false positive, but still left me shaking in a way only spreadsheets can't soothe. A client who refused to pay until I said the words late fee, in a voice that belonged to someone who had practiced saying it in a mirror. A text from my mother that read, simply, he relapsed, followed by, I'm going to the meeting they recommended. I sent back the address of a group that met on Wednesdays in a church basement with yellow chairs and a coffee pot that had seen some things. Later she wrote, thank you. I sat in the back. It helped to be with people who didn't pretend. I stared at the screen until the words steadied inside me. The podcast led to a panel, which led to a room where people with money and slides talked about user acquisition funnels, while I thought about a nurse in Wisconsin and a 10th grade classroom and a firefighter's lungs. When it was my turn, I said, we're not a funnel, we're a bench. People rest here and then keep going. A man with neat hair blinked twice and then wrote it down. After the panel, a venture partner with a kind face and terrible socks asked if we'd ever considered raising. Maybe, I said, wary of strings that can strangle. He surprised me. If you do, find someone who loves your smallness. Some businesses break when they grow. Some break if they don't. Know which one you are. I did. We were a harbor. We would widen, not tower. At home that night, I cooked a real dinner for the first time in months. Pasta with a sauce that tasted like tomatoes. Not regret. I ate at the pine table with the window cracked and the plant leaning toward the last light and thought about how many tiny pivots make a life feel different. A better chair. A second server. A sentence taped to a wall. A boundary kept. A hand not extended, not withheld, but held out steady. The voicemail came 2 days later, after a morning where the dashboard looked like a clean horizon and a lunch where I felt, for no reason at all, like the world was sitting properly on its axis. I saw the missed call, the familiar area code, the same voice trying to sound formal. I listened once, then again. Emily, my mother said, and there was no testing in the way she said my name this time, just weariness. Could we meet? There's something I need to tell you. I'm outside your building. She was a shadow behind the glass, hands tucked into the sleeves of that thrifted coat, trying to look like she belonged in a doorway she did not know. I pressed my palm to the buzzer and watched her startle, then steady herself as the lock clicked. When I opened the front door, the smell of rain rushed in, bright and metallic. "Hi," she said, as if we were neighbors who sometimes shared an elevator. "Come inside," I answered and stepped back so the door wouldn't touch her. We didn't go up. I steered her to the lobby couch, brown vinyl with a rip along one seam that someone had mended with clear tape, and sat in the chair opposite, my knees angled away so we each had our own air. She glanced at the mailboxes as if my name might explain me. Parker and Light LLC peered back in plastic letters I'd slid in myself. "I didn't want to impose," she said, folding her hands till the knuckles blanched. "I thought if I called from outside it might be easier to say." "Say what?" I prompted gently, because time is a kindness when you use it to spare someone from circling. She lifted her gaze, blue eyes that had once pinned me to mistakes. Now they were washed out, like a shirt that's seen too much sun. "I saw a doctor," she said. "Just a clinic. They think it's something with my heart." The word think did heavy lifting. "I get tired halfway through the stairs. I don't sleep." She tried for a joke that couldn't carry its own weight. "You always hated it when I didn't sleep." I kept my face still. The past will rush any doorway you leave open. "Did they give you a plan? A referral? A waiting list?" She managed a smile that cracked at the edges. "Do you know how to wait?" "Yes," I said, and we both heard the freight of it and let it pass. I took out my notebook, the one Carl had given me, grease stains still ghosting the cover, and drew boxes the way Tara had taught me when panic needed walls. Cardio clinic, medication assistance, short-term housing, support group. The pen moved. My voice followed. "We'll call this number for the clinic. We'll ask about cancellations. We'll apply here and here." I slid the notebook so she could see. "You'll keep the originals. I'll text copies. We'll write down who said what and when. No more floating." She nodded as if I'd handed her a railing on a staircase that frightened her. "I can do that," she said, then added, almost shy, "with you." The lobby door breathed traffic in and out. A kid with a skateboard clattered past. One of my neighbors hauled groceries in, gave me a 2-finger salute, and disappeared upstairs with the soft groan of the elevator. The ordinariness of it steadied me. I wrote the clinic's number on a sticky note and pressed it to the back of her phone. I printed a form from the shared computer in the manager's office and filled the fields she couldn't, leaving the ones she had to sign to her hand. "You don't have to take me in," she said suddenly, eyes darting to the stairwell, up toward rooms she hadn't been invited to since the word get out had slammed a door on another night. "I didn't come to move in." "I know," I said, and I did. A strange mercy, she had learned the shape of a boundary without me tracing it in marker. "If you need a bed for a few nights between places," I added, "I can put you in a hotel near the clinic." Practicality is a clean kindness. It keeps love from tipping and spilling. Her throat worked. I'd be grateful. We made the calls together. She listened the way people listen when they've decided to be helped, dignity upright, pride folded small but not abandoned. When the hotel confirmation dinged my email, I forwarded it to her and watched her face soften at the subject line with her name spelled right. On impulse, I opened Harbor on my phone and showed her the screen. "This is what it looks like," I said, not selling, just sharing. The home page breathed, pale green and quiet, with a single sentence waiting. "Write one line you needed this morning." She read it twice, then glanced at me as if asking whether she was allowed. I tilted the phone toward her. She typed slowly, index finger pecking the letters as if they might bruise. "You are not a mistake for needing help." When the save button warmed under her touch, she exhaled, a sound I recognized from the end of long cries I'd never been granted as a child. "It's simple," she said. "It has to be," I answered. "People arrive already tired." We walked to the curb together. The rain had thinned to the kind that lifts the smell of sidewalks and makes the world look newly washed. I hailed a cab, texted her the clinic address again, though it was already in her phone and in her pocket and in my notebook too. Redundancy is love in a bureaucratic world. Before she got in, she touched my sleeve 2 fingers, a quiet ask. "Emily," she said, and this time my name wasn't a test or a summons. "I'm sorry." The words were small, late, imperfect. They were also true. I didn't tell them to grow bigger before I let them in. "Thank you," I said. "Not I forgive you. Forgiveness is a slow animal that learns your scent over time. Thank you was the right size for the day." After the taxi pulled away, I stood in the doorway a long minute and watched the street reassemble itself around her absence. Then I climbed to my studio, sat at the pine table, and opened my laptop to the work that had become both raft and oar. The dashboard showed a steady swell. Mornings were busy, nights busier. Mateo had left me a note in our shared doc. "Databases happy, you need lunch." Leela had flagged a message she thought I should see. A woman in her 50s who wrote, "My daughter won't talk to me. I'm learning to be quiet without disappearing." I answered slowly, careful, honest, present, then added a new evening prompt: "Name one thing you can give without taking from yourself." By the end of the week, the clinic called with a sooner appointment. I forwarded the date, ordered a rideshare, and met my mother in the lobby again so we could count the forms together before she went. When she came back in the afternoon, she held a paper with words long and Latin. "Medication," she said, tapping the line that mattered. "A monitor for a bit." She looked up, suspicious of hope. "Manageable." "Good," I said, feeling the word seat itself. "We can manage." Outside, a delivery truck idled, hazard lights blinking like patient metronomes. My phone buzzed, an email from a firm whose name I recognized from bigger rooms. They wanted to talk about a seed round, the kind of money that changes the size of your decisions. I thought of Tara's text, "Don't chase wind." I thought of Mateo's schemas, Leela's ropes, Nora's plant, Carl's notebook. I thought of a harbor that would need to widen without losing the quiet it promised. I wrote back, yes to a conversation. We build small and sturdy. If that's not your speed, we'll pass. That night, I walked to the ocean and let the water take my ankles, then my shins, then back again. The horizon didn't look richer or poorer than the day before. It looked the same, which is another way of saying it looked like forever. I remembered the bench and the vow I'd made into my sleeve at 16. It had changed shapes so many times I barely recognized it. House to apartment to office to app to a room inside a phone where strangers breathed. But its heart was the same. A door that wouldn't slam. On my way home, I passed the bookstore with the bell that jingled a fraction too late. In the window, a display of paperbacks about beginnings posed as endings and endings that turned out to be doors. I caught my reflection, Older, steadier, and behind it, a line of text on a cover I couldn't read but felt anyway. Build what you needed. Offer it back. The voicemail waited on my phone when I reached the studio. Not hers this time. A different voice, warm and practiced. Emily Parker, it said. We loved your interview. If you're ever in Los Angeles, we'd like to have you on. I laughed in the quiet room, a sound that startled the plant into stillness. I didn't know then that a year later I would take a meeting in a glass box on a hill, that harbor would grow in careful rings, that the pine table would be moved to a space with windows taller than promises. I only knew the next step. Send the clinic a thank you, push a tiny update, text Mateo good news, sleep. In the middle of the night, my phone lit the ceiling with a soft square. A message from an unsaved number, but I knew it now without checking. Medication picked up. Thank you, sleeping. The period at the end made me smile. Boundaries, plans, pills in a bottle with her name spelled right. I put the phone face down and let the room darken again, the building breathing around me, the city carrying on its 1,000 small mercies. The bench felt far. The door felt sure. Somewhere beyond the edges of anything I could see, a larger one was being built. The months that followed unfolded like a series of quiet confirmations. My mother kept her appointments, sent clipped updates that sounded less like distress calls and more like someone practicing steadiness. Medications working. Doctor says keep walking. I made soup today. Each message was a stitch, small but holding. Harbor grew, too, but in the way trees grow, rings widening invisibly until one day you notice the shade has stretched farther than before. New users joined, not because of noise or ads, but because one person whispered to another. This helped me. Maybe it will help you. The inbox filled with sentences that carried the weight of lives I would never see. I wrote my first kind word to myself at 47. Your app reminded me to breathe before court today. I told my daughter I'm proud of her, and meant it. One evening, I sat at the pine table in the studio I still kept, the first place that was truly mine. The lamp cast a steady glow. The plants leaned toward the window, and on the wall above me were all the sentences I had taped through the years. Carl's notebook quote, Tara's reminder, Mrs. Dorsey's scrawled encouragement. They had become a constellation I could read in the dark. I thought about that night at 16, the slammed door, the bench on Maple and 3rd. How far those steps had carried me, to a business, to a voice, to a chance at rewriting the story my family handed down. And now, to a fragile peace with the very person who once told me I was nothing. Life does not erase. But sometimes, if you keep walking, it adds new lines beside the old ones until the page looks different. My mother came by one Sunday afternoon with a bag of groceries. She knocked lightly, and when I opened the door, she held up a jar of sauce, tomatoes this time, not sugar. Thought we could try again, she said. We cooked in silence that felt less like absence and more like learning. And as we ate, I realized the vow I made at 16 had come true. I had built a home no one could throw me out of, not because of its walls, but because of the steadiness inside me. So if you're listening to this and carrying your own version of that bench, that slammed door, that silence, you are not alone. You are not a burden. You can build something steady. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. I wish you health, peace, and a family filled with love. If this story has touched you, I hope you'll subscribe so we can keep walking through these chapters together. Take care of yourself and take care of each other.